Treatment of Autism and Asperger's in the Middle Ages, 514-53 CE. Autism and Asperger's syndrome, now unified under Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, are modern diagnoses, first formalized in the 20th century. In the Middle Ages, individuals exhibiting autistic traits, such as social withdrawal, intense focus on specific interests, sensory sensitivities, or repetitive behaviors, would not have been identified as such. Instead, they were often categorized under broader concepts like madness, insania, folly, fatuitas, demonic possession, divine affliction, or humoral imbalances. For example, excess black bile causing melancholy. High-functioning individuals might be tolerated or even valued as eccentrics, scholars, or holy fools, while those with more visible differences faced family care, institutional confinement, or persecution. Folklore, such as changeling myths, where fairies swapped children with unresponsive non-verbal changelings, may have served as a folk explanation for autism-like traits in children. Overall, treatment was inconsistent, blending charity, superstition, and exclusion, with monasteries emerging as inadvertent havens for neurodivergent people due to their structured routines and intellectual pursuits. Post-fall of Rome, barbarian societies and autistic people. After the Western Roman Empire's collapse around 476 CE, Germanic barbarian groups, for example, Franks, Goths, Vandals, formed kingdoms blending Roman law with tribal customs. Legal texts like the Leges Barbarorum, barbarian laws, say of 500-800 CE, address disabilities primarily through physical impairments, with little direct mention of mental differences. Mentally different individuals, potentially including those with autistic traits, were often excluded from legal roles, for example, witnessing contracts or serving on juries, to protect society from perceived unreliability. For instance, the Sachsenspiegel, 13th century reflecting earlier customs, barred the feeble-minded from inheritance, shifting their care to relatives. However, Germanic codes emphasized compensation over outright punishment. Wehrgild, blood money payments covered injuries causing disability, and some protections allowed impaired guardians in family matters if no alternatives existed. Autistic-like people likely integrated variably based on utility. High-functioning individuals might contribute as craftsmen or advisors, valued for specialized skills, while others were family burdens or outcasts. There's no evidence of systematic infanticide or expulsion for mental differences, unlike some Roman practices for severe physical disabilities, but tribal warrior cultures prioritized physical prowess, potentially marginalizing the neurodivergent. Rationalistic sagas and laws suggest a pragmatic view. Differences were acknowledged without heavy theological overlay until Christianization deepened. The Church's view on autism and neurodivergence. The Catholic Church, dominant after Rome's fall, viewed mental differences through a lens of sin, divine will, or demonic influence, but also Christian charity. Early medieval theology, for example, Augustine's City of God, saw madness as a soul-testing affliction or punishment for sin, yet redeemable through faith. By the High Middle Ages, humoral theory, from Galen via Arabic texts, framed it as bodily imbalance, treatable by diet, bloodletting, or pilgrimage. The Church established leper houses, almshouses, and monastic hospitals, for example, Hôtel Dieu in Paris, 7th century, that cared for the mad alongside the poor and sick, providing communal support rather than isolation. For autism-like traits, the Church was ambivalent. Repetitive behaviors or visions could be saintly, for example, ecstasies, or satanic. Exorcisms were common for perceived possession, but monasteries offered structure, prayer routines, isolation from chaos, that mirrored modern ASD therapies. Saints' lives, vitae, often romanticized neurodivergence as holiness, with miracles curing madness to affirm faith. Overall, the Church promoted protection over persecution, influencing secular laws to ward idiots, congenital cognitive differences, to the crown for oversight, blending custody with spiritual care. Saints, popes, kings, and knights on the spectrum. Retroactively diagnosing historical figures with autism is controversial and anachronistic, as it risks pathologizing eccentricity or imposing modern lenses on medieval contexts. That said, scholars have speculated on several based on biographies showing intense focus, social awkwardness, sensory issues, and visionary experiences. No popes are strongly linked, but here's a table of notable candidates. Hildegard of Bingen, childhood mutism, sensory overload, hyper-focus on theology and music. Biographies describe behaviors aligning with ASD. Thomas Aquinas, extreme shyness, minimal speech in youth, obsessive writing, aversion to touch. Louis IX, intense piety, rigid routines, social detachment. Edward the Confessor, reclusive, obsessive building, visionary dreams. These are interpretive. Historians caution against armchair diagnosis without risking historical distortion. Superstition, the church, and mobs. Dealing with neurodivergent groups. Medieval Europe brimmed with superstition, omens, demons, witches, amplifying fears of the other. Neurodivergent people, for example those with tics, mutism, or odd behaviors, were often scapegoated as bewitched, changelings, or werewolf-like, lycanthropy myths tied to madness. Mobs, fueled by plague paranoia or harvest failures, could lynch or expel them, as in 14th century pogroms blending anti-Semitism with disability prejudice.
The Church both mitigated and exacerbated this. It condemned mob violence via canon law, for example protecting the vulnerable as Christ's image, and promoted shrines for madness cures. For example, Thomas Becket's tomb drew pilgrims believing in miraculous healings. Yet inquisitors sometimes equated heresy with insanity, leading to trials. Late medieval witch hunts, peaking 1450s onward, targeted deviant women with mental differences, accusing them of pacts with Satan. Overall, church charity tempered mob fury, but superstition led to sporadic violence, especially in rural areas.
Neurodivergence in specific Dark Ages societies, c. 500–1000 CE. Early medieval, Dark Ages societies varied by region, blending pagan and emerging Christian views. Madness disability was often tied to fate, gods, or community duty. Frankish society, Gaul, Francia, Merovingian, Carolingian eras. Salic law, ca. 500 CE, compensated injuries causing disability. For example, fines for blinding, viewing mental differences pragmatically as burdens on kin. Charlemagne's capitularies, 8th century, urged church care for the poor mad, but superstition lingered, e.g. furious, rabid-like madness, seen as divine curse. High-functioning neurodivergence might serve as scribes in royal courts. Celtic societies, Ireland, Wales, Scotland. Limited records, but insular texts like the Voyage of St. Brendan, 8th century, depict madness as otherworldly trials, treatable by pilgrimage or herbal lore, for example mistletoe for melancholy. Brecon laws, Ireland, protected idiots via fines for harm, emphasizing tribal kinship care. Druids may have valued visionary madness as prophecy. Christianization shifted to monastic healing. Anglo-Saxon society, England, 5th, 11th centuries. Leech books, medical texts, recognized disorders like Weidhort, frenzied mind, possibly mania, autism meltdowns, and treated with herbs, for example betony for fiends in the mind. Beowulf portrays Grendel as monstrously other, reflecting exclusion of the mad. Laws of Ina, 7th century, fined assaults on the disabled. Monasteries like Jarrow sheltered eccentrics, for example Bede's scholarly isolation. Superstition linked madness to elves, witches, but community care prevailed. Viking society, Scandinavia, Norse, 793–1066 CE. Sagas, for example Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, rationally describe madness as reactive, grief-induced depression with psychosis. Berserker rage, dissociative episodes, possibly epilepsy, ASD overload, or hereditary. No exorcisms pre-Christianization. Odin worship valorized mad seers, vulva. Post-1000 CE, Christian Iceland integrated them via Althing assemblies, with families compensating for harms. Warriors respected battle-disabled as heroes, but chronic oddness led to outlawry, útlági. In summary, neurodivergent individuals navigated a world of tolerance through utility, charitable refuge, and peril from fear, with outcomes hinging on family, class, and era. High-functioning autistics often found niches in religious or intellectual life, while superstition posed risks amplified by mobs but checked by church doctrine.